On a limestone cliff in the Brecon Beacons, 17 trees are all that remain of a species found nowhere else on the planet. Not 17,000, not 1,700. 17 individual trees rooted into rock faces so steep that most of them have never once been touched by a human hand. This is Leigh's whitebeam, and for most of its history, nobody even knew it was in trouble. It grows nowhere else, in no botanical garden collection anywhere in the world, before a handful of dedicated people intervened, and in no other country on Earth. It was discovered in the 1890s, misfiled for decades, and nearly erased before botanists understood what they were actually looking at. But the real problem was never just the number 17. It was what those 17 trees could not do. They could not reproduce the way almost every other tree on Earth reproduces, and by the time anyone realized that, there was no obvious way to fix it. In 1896, a clergyman named Augustin Leigh was botanizing along the limestone crags of Breconshire in South Wales when he found a small tree he did not recognize. Leigh was a serious field botanist, the kind of Victorian vicar who spent his weekends scrambling over cliffs with a plant press, and he had already found a related rarity nearby 3 years earlier. He collected specimens of this new tree and noted the location, but it sat unclassified for decades, tucked into herbarium folders, while botanists argued over what it even was. It was not formally named until 1934, when the botanist Alfred James Wilmot examined Leigh's old specimens and finally recognized them as something new to science. He named it Sorbus Leyana, in honor of the man who found it. By the time the tree finally had a name, nobody knew how many were actually left in the wild, or whether the original site still held any at all. For nearly 2 decades after that, the tree was effectively lost again. Then, in the 1950s, a forester named Peter Charlesworth relocated a population clinging to the cliffs of Darren Fach, a limestone outcrop north of Merthyr Tydfil. Charlesworth propagated cuttings from what he found there, and that single act of foresight is the only reason any of this tree's genetic material survives in cultivation today. Later surveys located a second population on a neighboring cliff, and no others were ever confirmed anywhere else on Earth. 2 sites. That is the entire known range of this species. Not 2 countries, not 2 valleys. 2 cliff faces in the same corner of one Welsh county, both now protected as sites of special scientific interest, with one managed as a nature reserve by the Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales. The story stops being about numbers here and starts being about biology, because the biology is what makes 17 trees so much more fragile than it sounds. Whitebeams in the genus Sorbus have a strange reproductive trick called apomixis. Many species produce seed without fertilization at all. The seed grows into a plant that is genetically identical to its parent, a clone, not an offspring, in the same way a dandelion can set seed without ever being pollinated. For a tree rooted onto a single cliff ledge, this sounds like an advantage. It never needs to find a mate. It never needs pollen to drift in from another individual to reproduce. But it also means that every new tree is just another copy of a plant already struggling to survive in exactly the same narrow conditions. If the cliff erodes, if the climate shifts even slightly, if a pathogen finds one genetic weakness, it can exploit all 17 at once because there is barely any real genetic diversity left to fall back on. Occasionally, sexual reproduction happens anyway, when a whitebeam crosses with a rowan or with a neighboring whitebeam species growing close by. Those rare hybrid offspring can become genetically distinct enough to be classified as entirely new species in their own right, which is part of why Britain has one of the strangest catalogues of rare, hyper-localized white beams found anywhere on Earth. Britain is home to roughly 25 recognized Sorbus species, and a striking number of them exist in only 1 or 2 places. Sorbus bristoliensis grows only in a single gorge near Bristol. Sorbus minima is restricted to a single Brecon Beacons escarpment, the very rarity Augustin Lay had found 3 years before he stumbled onto the tree that would later carry his own name. Lay's whitebeam belongs to this same fragile family, a group of trees that barely reproduce and barely spread, each one a genetic dead end waiting to happen, and each one a potential new species waiting to be born from a single lucky pollination event that might not happen again for a generation. So the 17 trees were never just few in number. They were clones descended from a small handful of originals growing in one of the most exposed and least accessible habitats in Britain. They faced sheep and feral goats that graze the young shoots down before they can mature into anything resembling a tree, which is why site management on both cliffs has focused heavily on controlling grazing pressure and fencing off the most vulnerable ledges where fencing is even possible. They faced rockfall that could erase an entire ledge population overnight, and a habitat so narrow that a single landslide could functionally end the species in a single afternoon. Conservationists could not simply scatter seed downhill and wait for new trees to appear on their own. There was barely a safe way to reach the existing ones in the first place, let alone plant new ones in their place. Reaching Lay's whitebeam is not a walk in the woods. Both known populations grow on near vertical limestone, on ledges accessible mainly by climbing rope and a willingness to hang over open air with a pair of secateurs in hand, often in wind and rain, that make the cliff face even less forgiving. Botanists working with the National Botanic Garden of Wales had to physically abseil the cliffs to collect cuttings and seed from trees that had rarely, if ever, been sampled up close before. Every collection carried risk in both directions, to the climbers dangling above the valley floor and to the plant itself. Take too much material from one individual, and there is a real chance of damaging one of only 17 known trees left of an entire species. Some of the seed gathered on those cliff faces was sent south to the Millennium Seed Bank at Wakehurst, the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew facility that stores wild seed from around the world as insurance against extinction, giving Lay's whitebeam a frozen backup far from any Welsh cliff or grazing goat. Once material was collected, propagating Sorbus layana turned out to be difficult in its own right. Whitebeams do not always root reliably from cuttings, and staff at the garden had to work through cultivation techniques suited to a species that had essentially never been grown from scratch under controlled conditions before, testing different rooting conditions on material that could not simply be replaced if it failed. Trees successfully raised from wild material were established in the garden's living collection along the upper Broadwalk, creating a safety net copy of the species outside its 2 vulnerable cliff sites. Specimens were also placed with Cambridge University Botanic Garden, spreading the living insurance policy across more than one institution rather than leaving it in a single glasshouse. Additional young trees were planted at Penmoelalt, a new site meant to give Lay's whitebeam a foothold beyond Darren Fach and its neighboring cliff, in case either original population ever failed. But growing more clones only solved half the problem, because a genetic backup of the same handful of clones is still just a backup of the same handful of clones. Researchers still needed to understand the actual genetics of a tree that barely produces any variation to study in the first place. In 2018, a research team led by Tracy Hamston at the University of Exeter, working with Natasha De Vere at the National Botanic Garden of Wales and colleagues at the Jodrell Laboratory of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, published a genetic study in the journal Frontiers in Plant Science examining how apomixis and rare hybridization were driving the evolution of Welsh whitebeam populations, drawing on genetic material collected from the very cliffs the climbers had spent years working. The work traced how new sorbus species were forming through occasional hybrid events layered on top of near-total clonal reproduction, effectively mapping the family tree of a group of plants that, by most evolutionary logic, should barely be capable of generating new species at all. That research reshaped how conservationists think about protecting Lay's whitebeam. Saving the species was never only about protecting 17 individual trees. It was about protecting whatever narrow, accidental window of genetic exchange still lets new, viable whitebeams appear in the wild in the first place, a process these trees may only manage a handful of times across an entire human lifetime. Lay's whitebeam is not the only member of this family running this close to the edge. Roughly 400 miles north, on the Isle of Arran in Scotland, botanists have been fighting an even starker version of the same battle. The Arran whitebeam and its close relative, the cut-leaved whitebeam, arose the same way, as apomictic hybrids between rowan and rock whitebeam, and by 1980, surveys counted only a few hundred mature trees of each, confined to a handful of glens. Then, in the 1990s, researchers working with the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, identified a third Arran hybrid growing in Glen Cattercall, a tree so recently split from its parent species that for years only a single living individual was known anywhere on the planet, making the Cattercall whitebeam, for a time, arguably the rarest tree on Earth. Conservationists grafted material from that lone tree onto ordinary rowan rootstock to keep it alive in cultivation, and a second wild individual was eventually located nearby. Lay's whitebeam and the Arran whitebeams sit on opposite ends of Britain, but they share the same underlying fragility, a genus that creates new species through rare accidents of hybridization and then locks each new species into cloning itself into a corner. Today, Lay's whitebeam remains classified as critically endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The wild population has held reasonably stable at around 17 individuals for years, tracked by surveys that check every known tree on both cliff sites, ledge by ledge, year after year. This is not a recovery story in the traditional sense. Nobody involved is claiming the species is safe, and nobody expects the wild population to suddenly multiply. But cultivated trees now growing at the National Botanic Garden of Wales and at Cambridge, propagated from cuttings collected by climbers hanging off Welsh limestone, mean the species exists in more places on Earth than it has at any point since anyone started counting. A frozen backup sits in a vault in Sussex. A living backup grows in 2 botanic gardens hundreds of miles apart. And on 2 cliffs in the Brecon Beacons, the original 17 are still there, still being watched, still refusing to become a footnote. Walk the Upper Broadwalk at the National Botanic Garden of Wales today, and most visitors will pass a small tree without a second glance, unaware they are standing next to one of the rarest trees on the planet. It sits in a garden built partly because its wild relatives cannot be trusted to survive completely on their own, in a bed of soil hundreds of miles from the cliffs its ancestors have clung to for over a century. 17 trees on a cliff face in Wales, held together by rope work, careful cuttings, a vault of frozen seed, and a genetics paper obscure enough to fill a single quiet afternoon of reading. Sorbus layana was never going to make headlines. It just refused to disappear quietly. If this is the kind of story that does not make the evening news but probably should, there is another one on screen now.